She's a divorced woman who is living alone by herself. She always loved her husband and he loved her, but she thought that he cheated on her and she divorced him and left him. It's her second month that she didn't got her period, which made her scared and anxious. She didn't take it in another way and decided to go to a hospital for confirmation. When she entered the doctor's office, her eyes widened when she saw her ex-husband, and when he noticed her, his eyes widened in shock and surprise. "You?" he said coldly. "Why are you here?" she questioned him while her heart beat so fast. "I'm here for a medical checkup," he said nonchalantly, without looking at her eyes. She felt hurt by his cold behavior towards her, but she took a seat next to him, leaving one sit between them. He felt awkward to sit in the same place with her, especially after their divorce a year ago. He wanted to say something, but no word came out of his mouth. He only kept looking around and occasionally glancing at her out of curiosity and nervousness. She was feeling so many emotions, a strange mix of anger, guilt, hurt, excitement, and even a touch of love. She couldn't help but notice his scent and the way he ran his hand through his hair. Her mind and her body were betraying her. He suddenly looked at her. His sharp gaze met hers, and his gaze moved over her face, trying to read her. And she unconsciously felt her heart skip a beat. He couldn't help but notice how beautiful she is, even without makeup. All he wanted to do was to touch her cheeks and caress them softly and kiss them. He was reminded of their marriage and their life together. He remembered all the good and bad times they shared. He remembered her smile and her laugh, her kindness, her patience and loyalty. He felt a pang of longing and regret. He wondered if she missed him, just like he missed her. But then he shook his head, trying to push these thoughts away, convincing himself he was over her. A sudden silence fell between them, as if they were both lost in their thoughts. She was thinking about their past, their memories together, their good times, and the things that she missed about him. He was trying to hide the emotions he felt and keep his composure, but the more he looked at her, the more his heart ached. He began to speak to her as a doctor would to a patient, asking questions, checking her vital signs, and looking through her records. It was such a professional way of acting, which hurt her badly. But what hurt her the most is that it was a completely different way from how he spoke to her as her husband in the past. He tried to remain professional and not allow himself to show any personal feelings. His words were emotionless, and his eyes avoided her gaze. As he continued to take care of her and check her condition, he couldn't help but feel a sense of familiarity and intimacy. She was feeling so vulnerable and exposed in front of him. She was aware of his touch on her skin, his breath on her neck, and the way he looked at her from time to time. She felt like she was being both examined and scrutinized. Her heart raced and her body trembled at his proximity. He could see the effect he is having on her, and he felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and guilt. He knew that he shouldn't feel anything towards her, but he couldn't help it. Her small gasps, the way she flinched every time he touched her skin, all was causing his heart to thump against his chest. He began to monitor her symptoms and check for any signs of pregnancy. His hands ran over her stomach, feeling the soft curves and the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. He could sense that she was nervous and tensed. She could feel his touch on her stomach, igniting a fire within her she thought had been extinguished. She felt exposed and vulnerable as his fingers danced across her skin. Every time he touched her, she felt a jolt of electricity course through her body. She tried to hide her feelings, but her body couldn't hide its reaction. He noticed on the ultrasound machine a very faint shape of what appears to be a baby inside her. His heart skipped a beat as he looked at the screen. He couldn't believe his eyes. There was a baby, and it was growing inside her. He felt a rush of emotions, shock, excitement, disbelief, and a touch of joy, but he quickly hid it all. She saw his reaction and felt her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the way his eyes widened for a second, the brief moment when his hand trembled on her stomach, and his mouth gaped open. He tried to remain calm and composed, but he couldn't shake off the thoughts that running in his mind. The baby was real and growing inside her, and it was his. A mixture of emotions flooded him: fear, responsibility, guilt, and also a strange sense of pride. She noticed the way he seemed to have gone into deep thought, probably trying to process the news himself. He said nothing, and his jaw clenched tighter. She wondered what was going on in his mind, if he felt anything at all, if he was angry or happy that she was carrying his child. He stared at the screen for a long time, trying to process the information. 1,000 thoughts were racing through his mind. He tried to think logically and rationally, but the only thing he wanted to do was take her in his arms and feel her heartbeat against his chest, and her face buried in the crook of his neck. His eyes shifted from the screen to her face. His heart ached as she stared at him with a hopeful look in her eyes. He nodded slightly and said, "You are." She felt a mix of disbelief and joy. She had suspected that she was pregnant, but hearing him say it made it real. She couldn't believe that she was going to be a mother, and that it was his child. She looked at him, expecting some reaction, but his face remained stoic. There was no hint of emotion in his eyes. He was fighting against himself to keep his expression and voice neutral. He couldn't show her how he really felt, how much he cared and how much he wanted to protect her. He had to maintain the cool facade and pretend that it didn't affect him in any way. She couldn't contain her happiness as tears streamed down her face. She felt a mixture of emotions: joy, relief, fear, and uncertainty. But the dominant feeling was excitement. Excitement for the life growing inside her. He saw the tears in her eyes and felt his heart clench. He couldn't help but be drawn to her even more. Her vulnerability and the fact that she was carrying his baby was making him struggle to keep up his indifference. She sat up on the bed and felt his gaze on her, his eyes roaming across her body. She knew he was looking at her curves and her stomach where the baby was growing inside her. She couldn't help but feel a flutter of anticipation under his intense gaze. He couldn't help but feel a pang in his chest as he heard her voice filled with joy. The way she said the word mother, and the thought of her carrying his child, it made him feel a mixture of emotions that he had thought were buried deep. He couldn't hold back any longer. He took a step towards her. She looked at him with her bright eyes filled with hope and a hint of excitement. She had missed him so much, and here he was, standing just inches away from her. She felt her heart skip a beat and her stomach flutter as he closed the distance between them. He couldn't deny it. He was mad and hurt and confused. All those negative emotions he felt after she left him. But now, seeing her in front of him, with his child in her belly, he couldn't deny that he still had feelings for her. She braced herself for his reaction. She was ready for his anger and his cold remarks, but what she felt was something completely different. She felt his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb brushing away a lone tear that was trickling down her cheek. He felt a pang in his heart when he saw the sadness in her eyes. He wanted to be angry at her, and he was, but he couldn't help but feel sympathy for her. He knew she was sorry, and it showed in her face. in the way her lip trembled and her eyes filled with tears. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for forgiveness. She missed him so much and regretted leaving him. Now here they were, and there was something more. There was his child inside her, their child. He couldn't stay mad at her, not now when he knew she carried his child, their child. He could see the regret and sadness in her eyes, and he couldn't bear it. He took a step closer and pulled her in his arms, holding her tight. Her body fit perfectly against his, just like it used to before. He couldn't resist her cries and pleas. He pulled her closer to him, his arms around her waist, her head tucked under his chin. He felt her tears dampen his shirt and felt her body tremble against him. He let out a deep sigh and whispered, "Yes, I forgive you." She felt a wave of relief wash over her as his words hit her ears. She hugged him tighter and buried her face in his chest, breathing in his scent. She felt safe and comforted in his embrace, just like it used to be. She looked up at him, her eyes watery and sparkling. He looked at her, his heart softening more each second. Her eyes were teary and her hair was a mess, but to him she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, especially now that he knew she was carrying his child. He couldn't resist the urge to kiss her anymore. He lifted her chin up towards him and leaned down, his lips hovering over hers. He could feel her breath on his face, so close yet so far. His mind and body were in a battle, telling him to stop, but his heart was longing for her. They had finally decided to start fresh and give their relationship another chance. He arrived at her house and rang the bell, butterflies in his stomach as he waited for her to answer the door. His heart pounded in his chest as he heard her footsteps coming closer and the door opened. He saw her beautiful face with a smile on her lips. She looked stunning as always, but something was different this time. It was the way she carried herself, so confident and elegant, and the bright smile on her face that lit up her eyes. He was in awe of her and didn't realize he had been standing there speechless for a while till she waved her hand in front of his face to gain his attention. She chuckled softly, amused by his stunned expression. He shook his head and smiled, recovering from his daze. He was so mesmerized by her that he couldn't find the words to express it. He took a step forward and reached out his hand to take hers, feeling her soft skin against his calloused fingers. She felt a jolt of electricity running through her body as his fingers touched her hand. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt like fire on her skin. She looked up at him, and their eyes locked. His gaze was so intense and sincere that she couldn't hold it for long. Her cheeks flushed, and she looked away, feeling shy. He noticed her shyness and chuckled softly. He found it adorable and endearing, and it made him want her even more. He gently pulled her closer to him, his hand resting on her hip. He could feel her warmth radiating from her body and smell the faint scent of her perfume that he had always loved. She was so close to him that she could hear his heartbeat, loud and steady against his chest. She inhaled deeply, the smell of his cologne making her head spin. She looked up at him, her heart fluttering in her chest. The desire in his eyes matched her own, and she felt a sense of excitement mixed with anticipation. He was feeling the same way, the same desire, anticipation, and excitement. He could barely control himself, wanting to pull her close and kiss her senseless. His hand moved from her hip to her waist, and he pulled her even closer. Her body was flushed against his. He could feel the curve of her waist and the softness of her skin. They finally managed to compose themselves and start talking. They started reminiscing about their early days as a couple, their memories, and funny moments. They both kept smiling, feeling nostalgic and happy. But there was still an unspoken tension between them, the desire and need to be closer, to be intimate. It was hanging over them, making the air thick with tension. He noticed her stealing glances at him, her eyes roaming over his features, and her biting her lip as her mind seemed to wander. He was trying his best to focus on the conversation, but he couldn't help but notice her every movement. the way her hands moved gracefully when she talked, how her chest slowly rose and fell. The subject of their conversation shifted to their baby. Her face lit up when she talked about it, about the future, about their child. He could see the sparkle in her eyes and the excitement in her voice. He knew she was looking forward to this new chapter of their lives, and he felt a sense of love and awe for her. He was reminded of how strong and caring she is, and he felt lucky to have her as the mother of his child. She talked about how she wanted to prepare the baby's room and start buying baby clothes and other necessary items. She was so enthusiastic and engaged in the conversation, completely forgetting about the distance between them. He found himself listening to her intently, mesmerized by her passion and excitement. It fueled his own desire for what was about to come. As the conversation continued, their faces were just inches apart, her soft, sweet breath brushing against his skin. The atmosphere was charged with an electric tension, and their eyes were drawn to each other, their gazes locking. He felt the urge to reach out and touch her, to pull her towards him and claim her lips, to feel her soft body against his.